In case you haven't heard, Nintendo's reportedly told developers to make any Switch games from this point forward 4K ready, which would imply that a Switch Pro must be on the horizon for the near future. And that kinda makes sense given that the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X are running wild, but given that the Switch is barely even entering preschool, a lot of early adopters, and even more recent adopters too for that matter, would probably feel like they were being bamboozled by the above average sized end, and most of the new Switch games weren't playable without buying a more powerful upgrade. And if that were the case, then I'd certainly agree that it'd be a bit of a scam, since that'd pretty much make the Switch Pro a full-on successor that's backwards compatible. But even though I think the Switch could easily last a few more years without any upgrades whatsoever, just as long as it keeps getting strong first-party support, I could easily see the Switch's concern over being left in the dust for multiplats by Sony and Microsoft's new bad boys. But if you ask me, I think there's a few steps Nintendo could take that'd solve all the Switch's problems of being released halfway through the PS4 and Xbox One's life cycles without ripping any of the current Switch owners off, at least not too much anyway. And most of these steps happen to revolve around taking a page out of the Game Boy Color's playbook. So sit back in your neighbor's sauciest recliner, press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, America's most wanted prune smuggler, Cameron all one word, to tell you how a Nintendo Switch Pro can avoid being a scam by ripping the Game Boy Color off. Alright, so even though I've said a bunch of times in the past that I don't think Nintendo needs to have a Switch Pro to compete with the PS5 and Xbox Series X, that doesn't mean that I wouldn't personally love to have one, because even though I do think the third-party multiplats look just fine and the ports of older games from previous generations look great, it'd still be nice to not have to wait so long for games like Doom Eternal and be able to play games like the Resident Evil 2 remake, for example. Plus, I'd certainly welcome all the small upgrades like faster load times and probably 64 and GameCube games on the online service. But much like the Game Boy Color and new 3DS though, I think this would qualify the console as a full-on successor with backwards compatibility if there were even just one exclusive game that couldn't be played on a standard Switch, because it'd certainly be a slap in the face to any early Switch adopters any way you put it, even though most people probably wouldn't complain if there were only a handful of games that did this, seeing as how nobody really cared when the new 3DS did it. But on the other hand though, if Nintendo were to release a Switch Pro that doesn't have any games that take advantage of the hardware like the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, then what's the point in upgrading at all? Especially if the Switch Pro is only supposed to last around 2 years like the Game Boy Color did. Well, if you ask me, Nintendo's damned if they do and damned if they don't, so I think the solution would be to meet in the middle by copying the Game Boy Color with an upgraded Switch Pro that's got exclusive games, but rather than just doing this for like a year or two only to move on to the Switch's true successor, I think this should just be the Switch's true successor. Because like I said, the Game Boy Color and new 3DS were technically full successors with backwards compatibility anyway, so why not try and make the partial successor actually last more than a year or two? Like, I know the Game Boy Color did technically last for a few more years after the Game Boy Advance came out, but since it was considered old news by that point, pretty much everybody skipped out on all the exclusives for it, because even though they could still be played on the Game Boy Advance, the entirely new packaging just screamed obsolete for most people. However, even though Game Boy Color games fell off a cliff once the Advance was a thing, regular Game Boy games still managed to fare just fine during the 2.5-year window where the Game Boy Color was the king of the handheld market, despite the fact that the upgraded platform had a considerable amount of exclusives that took advantage of the slightly extra power. And the main reason for this is because while there were plenty of regular Game Boy games that were completely playable on the older models after the Game Boy Color came out, all the games with black cartridges from that point forward saw visual enhancements if you played them on the Game Boy Color, whereas the clear Game Boy Color exclusive cartridges had superior visuals, but you couldn't play them on the older models. And this is exactly what I think a Switch Pro should be, but with a bigger upgrade in power, and rather than lasting 2.5 years, they should try to at least get 4 years out of it till a new console's ready. This way, third parties could port their more demanding games over a lot easier, while developers working on games for the original Switch wouldn't have to worry about their games being overlooked or ignored for being on the older console that's perceived to be obsolete. But if they could also make those games have things like a higher frame rate if you played them on a Switch Pro, then I think it'd give people a lot more of an incentive to pick one up without it being mandatory. And look, I know a lot of people think that anything under 60 frames a second is unacceptable, and I can definitely respect that opinion, but even more so than color in video games back in 1998, some people really don't mind not having it all that much, and with so many games today not really needing to be graphical powerhouses to be great, the standard Switch could still hang on for a while longer and deliver great games that people would actually play, while the Switch Pro could still enhance those games while still providing a fair amount of exclusives that the performance-hungry fans can sink their teeth into. I mean, Nintendo even said themselves that they wanted the Switch to last 10 years, which even I'd say is impossible with the standard model, and with a full Switch successor that's got an entirely different name and games that come in completely different packaging, any games playable on the standard Switch would sell horribly, even if the full successor with a different name were backwards compatible. Personally, I thought the idea of the expansion pack on the 64 was actually pretty cool, even though it was kind of bordering into gaming PC territory, and I kind of wish that Nintendo had done something similar with the Switch somehow. Man, I know this probably wouldn't have been possible, but I'm just saying it'd have been pretty cool if they could have somehow pulled it off. But regardless, I think a Switch Pro being a considerable upgrade that doesn't hide from the fact that it's a full-on raging successor could really help the console last at least 4 more years without making the standard Switch feel like it's completely obsolete. Because even though the Game Boy Color only lasted 2.5 years, you gotta remember the fact that it came out 9 years after the original Game Boy when the upgrade was already long overdue. So a Switch Pro coming out a few years earlier than that's a good reason why it should last a little bit longer than 2 years, especially if the graphical upgrades for the exclusives are more significant, although I really hope that a unlock 64 and GameCube games in the new console. But anyway, what do you think the Switch should do? Does it need a minor upgrade with a full successor shortly after, a moderate upgrade meant to last a few more years, or no upgrade at all and just a brand new console altogether? Either way, let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody at some point. But let me tell you, if there's two people who have graphics that are so realistic they'll never need upgrades at all, then it would definitely be today's patrons of the day. Brubs, Dubs, and how are you doing, honey? If you want to be badasses like these two, then consider supporting FU Game Crew on Patreon for loot boxes and silly rewards in the mail. Send pictures or videos of you rocking merch if you want to make cameos in my videos, and follow me on Twitch if you ever want to hang out whenever I play video games sometimes. My name's Cameron, all one word, and I'll see you next time.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.